The first report was made before sunrise, while the lamps in the Calk County Sheriff's Office still burned yellow against the dust on the window glass. Otho Granick came in from the west on a lathered mule, alone, with his coat buttoned wrong and a black smear of stove ash across one cheek. He did not fall through the door like a man chased by fear. He stopped at the threshold, took off his hat, and asked whether Sheriff Tobias Clent was awake. That carefulness helped him. In the old county seat, where men were used to drunken alarms, cattle quarrels, and wind-torn rumors riding in before daybreak, a man who asked for the sheriff in a steady voice was often believed before anyone knew what he had come to say. The sheriff found him standing beside the stove with both hands around a tin cup of water. Otho owned Sage Hen Crossing, a trading post 27 miles out, where the freight road bent around Broomtail Creek and the last decent spring surfaced from a shelf of chalk and clay. He bought buffalo robes, sold flour, bacon, cartridges, quinine, kerosene, coffee, horseshoe nails, and bad tobacco. He kept a hitch rail, a hide yard, 2 cribs for grain, a half-sod stable, a forge shed, a wagon scale, and a ledger in his head sharper than any book. People said he could remember the weight of a flour sack 6 months after he tied it. People said he watered poor travelers without charge if a child looked sick. People also said he would count the nails before a coffin was built. But in that country, thrift was not considered a sin. It was considered survival. 2 men had vanished at his post, he told the sheriff. Their names were Larkin Bowe and Moss Dillard. Larkin was a narrow-faced former mule skinner from the old military road, 34 years old, with a habit of listening before he spoke, and a healed break in his left wrist that made his hand sit slightly crooked on a rein. Moss was younger by 5 years, broad in the shoulder, soft in the eyes, and known for laughing at the wrong times because silence made him uneasy. They rode together when work could be found. They hunted hides, guided emigrant wagons through dry reaches, and carried letters between settlements that had not yet earned post offices. Neither was rich, neither was famous. But they were the kind of men other men remembered, because on the frontier, a reliable man was more valuable than a celebrated one. They had reached Sage Hen Crossing 2 evenings earlier, Otho said, with 2 good bay horses, a pack mule, and saddlebags heavy enough to make the stable boy look twice. They ate beans beside the post stove, drank 1 cup of coffee each, refused whiskey, and asked whether a rider named Cleet Runnels had passed that way. Cleet was trouble. He had a thin scar through one eyebrow, a roan horse with a white tail, and a talent for appearing wherever quarrels had already begun. He owed Moss Dillard money from a hide sale down south. He had once drawn a pistol in a livery over a bridle. He had been seen near Sage Hen Crossing that same afternoon. That detail settled early in the sheriff's mind, like a burr in cloth. Otho said the 2 men slept in the stable loft. Just after midnight, he heard voices outside, then boots crossing the yard, then Moss knocking on the store door. Moss asked to buy cartridges, though he had bought some the evening before. He said Cleet had come back and cut the hobble rope on their pack mule. Larkin looked angry, not drunk, not frightened, just finished with being patient. Otho sold them 12 cartridges by lamplight, watched them saddle in the yard, and warned them against riding west before dawn. They did not listen. They believed Cleet was headed for Sand Crow Wash. They said they meant only to bring him back and make him answer for the mule and the money. Then Otho described the last sight of them so plainly that for years men repeated it almost word for word. He said Larkin swung into his dark saddle without using the stirrup, favoring the crooked wrist. He said Moss tightened his cinch twice, as he always did, because the bay he rode had a deep barrel. He said their horses moved out past the salt grass, with the mule trailing, 3 shapes dissolving into starlight, headed toward the low western breaks where the creek ran dry most months. He said the night was quiet enough that he heard one of them cough after the yard had gone dark. They did not come back. At first light, Otho found the west gate open, the yard churned in one corner, and a strip of red cloth snagged on a mesquite thorn near the trail. It looked like the edge of Moss Dillard's neckerchief. A half-mile farther, one of Otho's hired boys found a cartridge casing, fresh to the eye, and a patch of trampled sand, where 3 horses might have wheeled around hard. Otho had not touched it, he said. He had sent no one past that place until he could reach the sheriff. He wanted witnesses. He wanted it done properly. His voice shook when he said that. Not badly. Just enough. Sheriff Clint rode out with 2 deputies, 6 local men, a medical man who disliked horses, and Otho Granick showing the way. By noon, the story had a shape. By evening, it had a direction. By the 3rd day, it had a villain. They followed prints that broke and reappeared across Hardpan. They found the pack mule wandering without its load rope near a seep of bitter water. They found a torn glove finger in grass. Not much, but enough to make men bend over it and lower their voices. They found evidence of a small fire in Sand Crow Wash, and in the ashes lay a brass button like the ones Moss Dillard wore on his old army coat. By then, Cleet Runnels had vanished too. That fact seemed less mysterious than useful. A thief running west after killing 2 men looked exactly the way people expected a thief to look. The 2 good bay horses were never recovered. Neither were the saddlebags. Neither were Larkin Bow and Moss Dillard. For 6 weeks, riders searched the breaks west of Sage Hen Crossing. They looked into wolf dens and sinkholes, into limestone cuts and abandoned dugouts, along dry creek shelves where bones of cattle lay silver in the sun. They stopped wagons, questioned hidemen, woke sleeping drifters with carbines pointed at their blankets, and rode into settlements where no one had ever heard the 2 names. The newspapers, when they wrote about the case, did not call it a disappearance at first. They called it the Sage Hen outrage, then the Sand Crow murders, though no bodies had been found. Frontier papers liked a firm word. It gave uncertainty a handle. Otho Granick became the public face of the search because he knew the land, knew the water, and owned the last known place where the 2 men had been alive. He pinned handbills to his post door and to every freight office east of there. He offered $20 of his own money for word of the missing men or their horses. He rode with search parties until his mule went lame, then lent supplies without charging the county. When Larkin's sister Prudence came from Abilene, pale from the train and stubborn with refusal, Otho met her at the county seat and drove her himself to Sage Hen Crossing. He showed her where her brother had eaten, where he had slept, where he had ridden out. He spoke gently. He let her stand in the stable yard as long as she needed. He did not hurry her, even when the wind lifted grit into his own eyes. Moss Dillard's wife, Nettie, could not travel. She was near the birth of their first child and stayed with cousins in a settlement east of the railhead. Otho wrote her 3 letters. None promised what could not be promised. Each said the search would continue. Each told her Moss had been sober, alert, and in company when he was last seen. That comfort, repeated often enough, became a kind of cruelty later. But in the beginning, people praised him for it. Sheriff Clint believed Otho because the account fit the ground, and because disbelief would have required a different kind of courage than anyone then possessed. Sage Hen Crossing was built around its spring. Men came and went at all hours. There were teamsters sleeping in wagons, hide buyers moving through, children from emigrant wagons crying in the night, horses breaking ropes, dogs barking at coyotes. To imagine that 2 armed frontiermen could be harmed at the post itself, under the roof of a man everyone depended on, seemed less likely than an ambush beyond the gate. The west was where danger lived. Otho had only pointed at it. By winter, the county had almost stopped saying disappeared. Men said killed. They said Cleet Runnels did it. They said he took the horses, the money, and the saddles, then ran into the unorganized country where law thinned to nothing. A trapper later swore he had seen Cleet's roan near a camp beyond the state line. Another man swore he had seen Moss's saddle in a Mexican trader's wagon, though he had been drunk when he saw it, and drunker when he remembered. Someone mailed a watch to the sheriff from an unknown town, claiming it had been taken off Cleet in a card game. The watch did not belong to either missing man, but the rumor that it did lasted longer than the correction. Prudence Bowe stayed 3 weeks. She walked the yard at Sage Hen Crossing every morning and asked questions that made men uncomfortable. Why had her brother and Moss ridden after Cleet before dawn, when they had planned to leave for the land office in Calk City? What land office business? Otho asked her. She said Larkin had written that he and Moss had found something west of the spring, something about an old survey marker and a claim filed under the wrong boundary. Otho shook his head. He had never heard of it. Larkin had said nothing to him. Frontiermen often talked large in letters, he told her, when they wanted family to believe they were closer to fortune than they were. She disliked that answer, but could not break it. She had only the memory of a letter, not the letter itself. The paper had been in Larkin's saddlebag, he had told her, along with a rubbing of the stone and a witness statement from Moss. The saddlebag was gone. Therefore, the proof was gone. Otho's face softened when she said that. He told her he was sorry. He told her men like Cleet Runnels had a way of destroying more than bodies. That was how the first lie became useful. It did not have to answer every question. It only had to make better sense than pain. Cleet Runnels was caught 9 months later in a rail camp brawl in southern Colorado. He had no bay horses, no saddlebags, no money that could be tied to Larkin or Moss, and no red cloth in his possession. He laughed when asked about the missing men, but he laughed at nearly everything. He admitted cutting a hobble rope at Sage Hen Crossing because Moss had called him a cheat. He admitted owing money. He admitted leaving before midnight, not after. Then he changed his story twice and cursed the sheriff who wrote it down. The inconsistency hurt him more than evidence would have. He was charged with horse theft in another county and sent away. In Calk County, men said the law had failed only because the right crime could not be proved. Years did what years do. They took the sharp edges off the living and polished the lie until it looked like local history. Children learned not to ride west of Broomtail Creek after dark. Teamsters pointed to Sand Crow Wash and said 2 good men had been butchered there for their horses. Otho Granick aged into respectability. He built a second storeroom at Sage Hen Crossing, then a feed stable, then a plank sleeping room for freight crews. When the cattle drives shifted, he bought hay ground near the creek. When the railroad pushed farther west and the old freight road thinned, he moved part of his trade to town and left a nephew to run the post in dry seasons. He joined the school board. He put money into a brick church. His hair went white at the temples and gave his hard face a look of judgment. The trading post itself began to shrink before anyone noticed. The spring still ran, but the road no longer needed it the way it had. Wagons gave way to rail schedules. Hide stacks disappeared. The forge roof sagged. The stable loft took birds. The old salt room, once packed with barrels and smoked meat and sweating sacks of stock feed, became a place for broken tack, cracked yokes, rusted traps, window shutters, and anything no one valued enough to move. A door was nailed shut against snakes. A second door warped open in summer and slammed all winter when the wind found it. 19 years after Larkin Bowe and Moss Dillard vanished, Sage Hen Crossing was bought by the county at tax sale. Nobody wanted the land except for the spring and the old lumber. The county board thought the beams could be reused in a school addition at Calk City if they were pulled before weather ruined them. The post had become a relic by then, a low, sun-eaten shape in the grass, more memory than business. Children from nearby claims played ghost games there until their mothers heard and forbade it. Letha Band came to the place on an October afternoon with 3 hired men and a wagon for salvage. She was 32, a school teacher with ink on her cuffs and a practical dislike of waste. Her uncle had once shoed horses at the Sage Hen Forge, and she had spent part of her childhood waiting in the yard while he worked. She did not remember Larkin Bowe or Moss Dillard as faces. She remembered the story as adults told it, lowering their voices at the point where the men rode west. That afternoon, the sky was so pale it seemed rubbed thin, and dust lifted under every step before settling back into grass roots. The men pulled warped boards from the sleeping room first. Then Letha asked them to open the old salt room because the county had paid for all salvage, not only what was easy. One of the men objected. The place stank of mice, old hides, and damp earth. The ceiling beam was cracked. The north wall looked buckled. Letha told him to be careful, not lazy. When the first panel came loose, black dust poured down. Not gray dust, not the powder of dry wood, but dark granules mixed with old seeds and strips of canvas chewed thin by mice. Behind the panel was not open wall, but a narrow false bay packed with burlap sacks gone to threads. Something curved and hard showed through. The hired man reached in and touched leather. He thought at first it was a side of dried hide, folded and forgotten. Then he found a stirrup iron. Letha climbed onto an overturned crate and held the lantern close. A saddle hung wedged inside the wall, its horn bent sideways, its skirts pressed flat by 19 summers and 19 winters in the dark. Behind it was another. They were not stacked like goods. They had been forced in, wrapped, sealed, and abandoned. The room went quiet. Even the men who had laughed at snakes stopped moving. Letha did not know whose saddles they were in that first minute, but she understood at once what they were not. They were not abandoned trader's junk. They were not loose tack from a defunct post. Each was a working man's saddle, costly for its time, repaired again and again by someone who intended it to last. The first had a copper star on the left side of the pommel, one point broken and smoothed by use. The second had a row of small dog-tooth stitches along the cantle, darker than the rest of the leather, the sort of personal repair a man could identify from across a yard. Both still carried cut cinch straps. Both had saddle blankets crushed beneath them. Both smelled, when the canvas was pulled away, not of trail weather, but of salt, old smoke, and closed wall. By sunset, Sheriff Win Cobble stood in the salt room with his hat in one hand and his face set in the expression of a man trying not to let wonder turn him foolish. He was too young to have investigated the original disappearance. He had been 6 years old when the 2 frontier men rode into county legend. His father had ridden with one of the search parties and had died believing Cleet Runnels guilty. Win had grown up with that belief hanging in the background of barbershop talk, memorial sermons, and election day whiskey. To question it felt at first like stepping on a grave. But the saddles were there, not in Sand Crow Wash, not in a bandit camp, not lost on a westward trail. They were inside the wall of the trading post, owned by the man who had reported seeing them carried into darkness. The next morning, the county attorney ordered the old salt room locked. 2 men stood guard, partly to protect evidence, and partly to keep half the county from pushing inside to look. By noon, the story had reached town. By evening, it had reached Otho Granick. He was 68 then, broad in the belly but not weak, with white hair brushed straight back and eyes still sharp enough to make younger men stand straighter. He lived in a clean house near the church he had helped build. When Sheriff Cobble came to ask him about the saddles, Otho received him in the front room under a framed sampler that read, in blue thread, "Thirst is answered by Providence." He did not sit until the sheriff sat. He did not ask why the sheriff had come. That was the first detail Win noticed and disliked. Otho listened to the description without moving, except to press one thumb against the knuckle of the other hand. "Then Cleet hid them there," he said. "Cleet Runnels?" Wynne asked. "Who else?" "He would have had to bring both saddles back to your post after killing 2 men in the West Breaks. He would have had to know the Walbay existed. He would have had to hide them in a room you used." Otho's expression barely changed. Men who do evil take risks for reasons honest men can't understand. "And you never found them?" "I did not open walls looking for ghosts." It was a good answer. Too good, maybe, but the kind of answer people had been accepting from Otho Granick for most of his life. Wynne left with no confession, no slip, no softening. Still, as he crossed the porch, he looked back through the front window and saw Otho standing alone beneath the sampler, no longer pressing his thumb, only staring at the closed door as though sound from 19 years earlier had begun coming through it. The first problem with the saddles was not proving whose they were. That came quickly. Prudence Bowe, older now, came in on the morning train after receiving Wynne's telegram. She carried herself with the same stubborn refusal that people had remembered from her first visit to the county. Her hair had gone silver at the temples, and grief had not kept her young. She stepped into the evidence room, saw the copper star on the first saddle, and put one hand on the table before anyone could steady her. "That was Larkin's," she said. She pointed to the broken star. Larkin had caught it on a freight chain outside Fort Armitage years before. He had filed the broken point smooth himself so it would stop tearing his coat. She pointed to the left stirrup leather, shortened by one hole because of the crooked wrist that changed the way he mounted. She pointed to 3 small burn marks near the horn from a fire at a winter camp. She did not weep until she saw the underside of the saddle skirt, where Larkin had scratched a plain little mark with an awl. LB, not for display, only so no one in a crowded stable could claim confusion. Moss Dillard's daughter identified the second saddle. Her name was Alma, after an aunt, and she had been born 2 months after her father vanished. She had never heard his voice. Her mother, Nettie, had kept a description of the saddle in a Bible because it was one of the few practical things she knew about him. Dog-tooth stitches on the cantle, a replacement stirrup on the right, a tobacco burn the size of a bean near the rear skirt. Alma looked at these proofs as if each one had arrived late from a man she had been told to mourn before she met him. She did not touch the leather at first. Then she put 2 fingers on the dog-tooth seam and said, "He did not ride west in this." That sentence did more than identify property. It broke the county's oldest arrangement with itself. Wynne Coble began with the original file. It was disappointingly thin, not because Sheriff Clint had been careless, but because frontier investigations often survived as fragments. Witness names without addresses, distances guessed by horse time, sketches drawn on the back of tax notices, statements summarized because paper was dear. Otho's account took 4 pages. The search map took 1. Cleet Runnels's Colorado questioning took 2.5, the half-page damaged by water long ago. There were no photographs of the tracks, no plaster casts, no exact record of who walked where before the sheriff arrived. The evidence that had once seemed abundant now looked like a fence built from smoke. Yet small things remained. The red cloth from the mesquite thorn had been folded into a packet. Everyone had called it Moss's neckerchief because Moss wore red cloth at his throat. But Alma Dillard brought one of her mother's keepsakes, a strip cut from Moss's actual neckerchief before he left on his final work trip. The 2 reds were not the same. Moss's was wool, soft and tightly woven. The evidence strip was cheap printed cotton from bolt cloth sold in Otho's own store. It had faded in a way wool would not. That did not prove murder. It proved staging, and staging was the first solid thing the county had possessed in 19 years. The cartridge casing was worse. A gunsmith in Calk City examined it and said it had not been fired from either of the missing men's known rifles, which had never been recovered anyway. That helped little, but the casing had a shallow dent on one side, the sort caused by a weak extractor in a particular old Spencer carbine. Wynne found 3 men who had owned such guns in 1874. 2 had been away during the disappearance. The third was Otho Granick. He claimed the carbine had been stolen from his post months before Larkin and Moss vanished, then found later under a hay rack with a ruined stock. When asked why that theft had never been reported, he said men did not burden sheriffs with every missing tool. A statement from the original stable boy mattered more. His name was Jem Parrish. In 1874, he had been 15, half-starved, and grateful for work that included meals. In 1893, he was a worn man with a cough, living behind a feed store in another town and repairing harness when his hands allowed. He had not been named in the old file except as Boy at Post. Wynne found him because Letha Bann remembered an uncle saying the boy had left Sage Hen Crossing suddenly after the trouble. Jem did not want to talk. He had learned long ago that old fears can outlive the men who planted them. Wynne and Prudence Bowe sat with him on a back step while chickens scratched in dust under a gray sky. For nearly an hour, he said he remembered only what everyone remembered. Larkin and Moss came. Cleet quarreled. Otho said they rode west. Then he grew tired, or ashamed, or simply too old to keep protecting a night that had never protected him. I never saw them ride, Jem said. Prudence closed her eyes. Jem stared at his hands. He had been sleeping in the stable loft, above the stalls, near enough to hear voices in the yard, and not enough to make sense of every word. He heard Moss Dillard laugh once, short and strained, sometime after supper. He heard Otho tell someone to lower his voice. He heard a chair fall inside the store. Later, much later, he heard a horse let out and another behind it. He thought the men were leaving. He did not climb down. Boys who valued meals did not interfere with grown men's business. Before dawn, Otho woke him and said Larkin and Moss had ridden after Cleet, and that Jem should help look for signs near the west gate. Otho already had the strip of red cloth in his hand. Jem remembered that because Otho's fingers were stained with stove black, and the red cloth looked bright in them. He also remembered seeing a light in the salt room when no one should have been there, and hearing leather scrape across boards, as if heavy tack were being dragged, not carried. When he asked about it the next day, Otho slapped him hard enough to split his lip and said, "Fear made boys hear foolish things." "Why didn't you tell Sheriff Clint?" Wynne asked. Jem gave him a look without anger. "Because Mr. Granick fed me. Sheriff Clint liked him, and I was 15. It was the simplest explanation and the most damning. The second witness had been dead for 12 years, but he had left behind a habit. Orville Sance, the saddle maker who once repaired tack at Calk City, kept paper patterns for unusual work. His grandson found them in a trunk after Wynne asked. Among them was a rubbing of a dog-tooth cantle stitch done for Moss Dillard, along with a note in Orville's hand. Customer says Dillard tightened cinch twice. Right stirrup mended with wagon trace leather. The date was 5 months before the disappearance. Another slip described Larkin Bowe's copper star and crooked wrist mounting wear. These were not dramatic records. They were trade memory made physical. They closed the door on any claim that the saddles belonged to other men. What mattered next was how long the saddles had been hidden and by whom. The wall bay in the salt room had not been part of the original structure. 3 elderly freighters remembered Otho adding that wall after a winter leak, saying he wanted to keep the salt and cured meat drier. A carpenter had helped him for 2 days. That carpenter had left Kansas years before and could not be found. But his brother remembered hauling boards to Sage Hen Crossing in the autumn after the disappearance. The boards had come from crates that once held lamp chimneys and kerosene cans. Several crate stamps were still visible on the inside of the panel Letha Band's workers removed. One stamped date matched a shipment delivered 4 months after Larkin and Moss vanished. That meant the false bay had been sealed after the search, after Prudence had gone home, after the county had mostly accepted that the trail led west. Otho's defenders seized on that timing. If the bay was built months later, they said, Cleet Runnels or any other passing criminal could have hidden the saddles there before the wall closed. The argument sounded possible, only if spoken quickly. Wynne walked the old post with Letha Ban and saw how impossible it was in practice. The salt room had been behind the store counter. Its door could be seen from the stove, the yard, and the sleeping room. A stranger carrying 2 heavy saddles would have had to pass through the heart of Otho's business, open a storage bay no one knew existed, wrap the saddles, pack the burlap, and vanish without leaving memory in a place where strangers were noticed for a living. The saddles had not been hidden by a passerby. They had been kept until the wall was ready. That raised a worse question. Where had they been before the wall existed? The saddle blankets answered in a language slow men could understand. They were stiff with old salts and dark dust. Not ordinary trail dust, not creek mud, not stable dirt. Letha's uncle, the former forge man, took one look and said the granules were from the hide vats. Sage Hen Crossing had used a clay-lined pit for curing and scraping buffalo hides in the early years, set beyond the salt room, but close enough that workers could roll barrels to it. A mixture of alum, ash, stale brine, and hair dust had soaked that place. A man who had worked around hides never forgot the smell. Even 19 years later, faint and sour, it lived in the saddle blankets. Wynne ordered the old hide yard cleared. The county laughed, then came to watch. Men with shovels cut through grass, ash, broken barrel hoops, and wind-packed trash. The hide pits had collapsed long before, their edges rounded by weather until they looked like shallow ground. For 2 days, they found nothing but ox bones, rust, bottle glass, and a child's marble with a crack through it. On the 3rd afternoon, one shovel struck dressed limestone where no dressed stone belonged. The pit had been capped. They pried up the first stone. Beneath it was dry earth, packed hard and bitter with lime. No one joked then. Sheriff Cobble sent the watchers away except for the doctor, 2 deputies, the county attorney, and Prudence Bowe, who refused to leave. Alma Dillard was not there. Someone had spared her the digging, though later she said no one had had the right. The remains were not described in the newspapers beyond what decency allowed. 2 men were found in the sealed hide pit, close enough to one another that the doctor said they had been placed, not lost. With them were a belt buckle Prudence recognized from Larkin's letters, a broken pocket compass, a pipe stem Nettie Dillard had once carved with a tiny cross for Moss before they married, and 2 boot heels with nail patterns matching accounts from the town cobbler. The doctor could not say exactly how they died. One skull showed blunt damage. One rib carried a small lead ball flattened near the bone. That was enough for murder, if not enough for every detail. Calk County changed in a day. Men who had spent 19 years saying Sand Crow Wash now found themselves saying Hide Pit. Women who had accepted the tale because accepting tales was sometimes the only way to keep living suddenly remembered questions their husbands had brushed away. The old searchers looked ashamed and angry in equal measure. Cleet Runnels, long gone from the county and rumored dead by some, was found alive in a New Mexico mining camp after a newspaper carried the story. His answer came by letter, written in a hand made jagged by age and injury. He admitted being a thief, a liar, and a fool, but not that. Not them. He wrote that he left Sage Hen before midnight because Otho had looked at him in a way he did not like, and because Larkin Bowe had asked whether he would testify about the old survey stone if paid. Cleet had refused, stolen a plug of tobacco from the counter, and ridden east, not west. The old survey stone returned like a thing called by its name. Prudence had mentioned it in 1874 and been dismissed. In 1893, Wynne went looking. Land records showed that the claim around Broomtail Spring had once belonged in part to a dead teamster named Abner Bow, Larkin's uncle, who had marked a corner near a bent cottonwood before leaving for work down the military road. The county map later placed the spring within Otho Granick's parcel, a correction so old no one questioned it. The surveyor who made that correction had drowned drunk before statehood papers were properly settled. His notes were missing. The boundary stone itself had never been produced. But Larkin had found something. Moss had written to Nettie, in the only letter she kept from that summer, that Lark has a stone rubbing, and says the old man at Sage Hen will have to smile different when paper talks. Nettie had never understood it. She had thought it a joke. Now the sentence landed with force. Wynne searched the post again, not inside the rooms, but outward, toward places a man might hide a stone too heavy to burn and too marked to leave. Near the old chicken yard, half buried under a collapsed plank trough, a deputy found a square block of chalk limestone with one corner broken and the faint cut of letters under dirt. It took water, brushes, and low sunlight to read them. A.B. and a crude arrow pointing east. It was not court-ready by itself. It was old, weathered, and possibly movable. But beside it, pressed into a rusted coffee tin and sealed with wax gone brittle, were scraps of paper wrapped in oilcloth. Not a confession, not a letter. Something smaller and more stubborn. 2 rubbed impressions of the same stone, one labeled in Larkin Bow's hand, one witnessed by Moss Dillard. A measurement from the spring to the original corner, and a short statement saying that Otho Granick had fenced the spring outside his true claim and charged water fees on land not his. Otho had kept the proof. That frightened Wynne more than if he had destroyed it. Some men hid incriminating things because they feared being caught. Others kept them because possession felt like victory. Otho had hidden Larkin's proof on his own land for 19 years, as if the papers were a captured flag. When confronted with the stone, Otho changed, not publicly. In the interview room, he still sat straight, beard combed, cuffs clean, hands folded. But his answers grew shorter. The polished explanations that had once come easily began to show gaps. He said Larkin never showed him the rubbing. Then he said Larkin had shown him something, but it was nonsense. He said Moss was too ignorant to understand land measurements. Then he said Moss had threatened to lie for money. He said the spring had always been his. Then he said he had improved it, fenced it, kept it open, made it useful, which in frontier speech was not the same as ownership, but often mistaken for it by men with rifles and habits of command. Wynne asked why Larkin's rubbing was found, hidden near his chicken yard. Otho looked at him for a long time. "A man can plant paper," he said. 19 years ago? Any year. And saddles? Otho's mouth tightened. "You have built yourself a story, Sheriff." "No," Wynne said. "I inherited one. I'm taking it apart." The trial began in January, with snow driven flat across the courthouse steps, and people packed so tightly in the hall that the judge threatened to clear the room twice before breakfast. Otho Granick was not tried for land theft. He was tried for the murders of Larkin Bow and Moss Dillard. But the spring lay under every word. The prosecutor did not present Otho as a wild killer. That would have failed. Too many people had known him too long as a merchant, board member, church donor, and old man who tipped his hat to widows. Instead, the prosecutor presented him as a man who believed that whatever he held long enough became his by right. The defense leaned on time. 19 years, they said, had rotted memory. 19 years had changed loyalties, sharpened grudges, and made ordinary objects mysterious. Cleet Runnels was a confessed thief, and still the likeliest culprit. The saddles might have been hidden by someone seeking to blackmail Otho, then forgotten. The remains in the hide pit proved only that 2 men died near Sage Hen Crossing, not who killed them. The land papers proved only a dispute, not murder. If every dead dispute could hang an old man, the defense said, no pioneer would be safe from the ghosts of men who had lost arguments. Some jurors nodded. Time was the defense's strongest witness. Then Jem Parrish took the stand. He looked smaller in the courthouse than he had on the feed store step. The oath trembled in his mouth. Otho did not look at him at first, which told half the room all it needed to know. Jem testified to the chair falling, the light in the salt room, the red cloth already in Otho's hand before anyone searched, the sound of leather dragging, the slap, and the warning. On cross-examination, the defense asked why he had waited 19 years. Jem answered without drama. Because I thought nobody would believe a hungry boy over the man who owned the spring. No sentence in the trial was quoted more often. Prudence Bowe testified next. She spoke of her brother without ornament. He was cautious. He was not reckless. He did not ride into unknown breaks at night over a debt when he planned to go to the land office at first light. He had written about the survey stone. He had said Moss would witness it. She had told Otho that in the yard 19 years earlier, and he had dismissed it before she finished. Alma Dillard testified about inheriting a father through absence. The defense objected when emotion entered her answer, and the judge sustained part of it, but the jury had already heard enough. She did not say Otho killed her father. She simply identified the saddle, the dog-tooth stitches, the pipe stem, and her mother's letter. Her restraint gave the testimony weight. She had never been able to know Moss Dillard as a man, she said, but she knew what had been stolen from the record of him. He had not run after a thief in darkness. He had remained at the post, close enough for the truth to be hidden behind a wall. The saddles themselves were carried into court on the 4th day. They looked smaller indoors. On a horse, a saddle has shape and purpose. On a courtroom table, it becomes an absence made of leather. Men leaned forward. Women in the back raised handkerchiefs to their mouths. Otho looked at the copper star, then away, but in that instant his face altered. The county saw not guilt exactly, not yet, but recognition stripped of performance. The saddles were not evidence to him. They were things he had touched in the dark, things he had forced out of sight, things that had waited longer than he had feared. The prosecutor walked the jury through the practical sequence. Larkin and Moss arrived with proof that threatened Otho's ownership of Broomtail Spring. Cleet Runnels quarreled with them, giving Otho a ready-made shadow. After supper, Larkin confronted Otho inside the store, likely with Moss beside him. The confrontation turned violent. Otho used his own carbine for the shot that killed or disabled one man, and a wagon iron or other blunt tool against the other. He hid the bodies first in or near the hide pit, then used lime and capped the place with stone when opportunity allowed. He took their personal saddles because blood, marks, and ownership made them dangerous. He created signs of a westward chase using cloth from his store, a cartridge from his own carbine, and carefully led horses. Later, he sold or traded the animals far enough from Calk County that they vanished into common traffic. When the search cooled, he sealed the saddles into the salt room wall during renovations and hid the land proof near the chicken yard, where he could keep power over it. The defense called it imagination. The prosecutor called it a chain. The jury had to decide whether each link held. One link came from a woman named Saraya Venner, who had been a young widow traveling east with 2 children in a broken wagon the week after the disappearance. No one had interviewed her in 1874 because no one had thought she mattered. She had written to Sheriff Coble after reading about the saddles, saying she remembered seeing Otho on the trail with 2 bay horses and no mule, leading them before daylight 2 days after the search began. She remembered because he refused to sell her flour on credit later that same morning, and because one of the bays had blood or dark paint on its shoulder. On the stand, she admitted the color might have been mud. The defense pressed her hard. 19 years, they said. 19 years, and a newspaper story. She agreed memory could be treacherous. Then she described Otho's left glove, split at the thumb seam, wrapped with twine. The prosecutor produced a search party sketch showing Otho with that very glove. It did not prove murder either. But like so much in the case, it gave memory a peg to hang on. The last evidence was not dramatic. It was arithmetic. Otho had claimed in 1874 that he left for the sheriff's office shortly after first light, as soon as he realized the men had not returned. The distance from Sage Hen Crossing to Kalk City could be made in 5 hours on a fresh horse, longer on a mule. He arrived before sunrise? That had always been the phrase in recollection. But the sheriff's old docket gave the actual time, 4:30 in the morning. A stage driver's log from the same week recorded moonset and weather. If Otho left only after first light, he could not have arrived when he did. If he arrived when he did, he left the post before the time he claimed to have discovered the disappearance. It was a small clerical fact, nearly lost under dust in the courthouse attic. It struck harder than rhetoric. The original report had not been hurried after alarm. It had been prepared during the night. When the prosecutor read the docket time aloud, Otho closed his eyes. He opened them quickly, but not quickly enough. The jury deliberated through supper and into the cold evening. People waited in the courthouse yard, stamping feet, passing coffee, speaking in whispers because the dead had begun to feel present. At 9:30, the jury returned. Guilty for the murder of Larkin Bowe. Guilty for the murder of Moss Dillard. Otho Granick did not collapse. He did not shout. He asked whether he might speak before sentencing, and the judge, after a long pause, allowed it. Everyone leaned in expecting denial, confession, maybe some final polished speech about injustice. What Otho gave them was stranger and uglier. "I made that spring," he said. The judge told him to address the verdict. "I found it a mud hole," Otho said. His voice was steady, but his eyes moved from face to face, as if the room had become the old yard, and everyone in it owed him water. "I dug it out. I boxed it. I kept stock from fouling it. I built where there was nothing. Men came to me because I made that place worth coming to. Then 2 riders bring a stone and say the ground under my labor belongs to a dead man's kin. They would have ruined the crossing and called it law." Prudence Bowe stood so abruptly, the bench scraped behind her. Wynne thought she might speak, but she did not. She only stood, breathing through the moment. Otho stopped there. He never said, "I killed them." He never said he was sorry. His statement was recorded as rambling and irrelevant by one paper, and as near confession by another. To the families, it was neither. It was the sound of motive with the last curtain pulled away. He was sentenced to life imprisonment. Because of his age, many believed he would not live long inside stone walls. They were right. He died 17 months later, still claiming the spring had been stolen from him by law and rumor. He left no written confession. Men who needed confession to believe in truth were disappointed. The Saddles had already done what his words refused to do. After the verdict, Kalk County had to decide what to do with Sage Hen Crossing. Some wanted it burned. Some wanted the spring closed. Letha Ban argued against both. Fire would make spectacle of what should be understood, she said, and closing a spring punished the living for a dead man's greed. The county dismantled the dangerous structures, plank by plank. The salt room wall was preserved in part, not as shrine, but as evidence of where the lie had slept. The hide pit was filled only after the remains were removed and the ground was marked. Broomtail Spring was surveyed again, correctly this time, and placed under public use with no toll charged for water. Larkin Bowe and Moss Dillard were buried on a hill east of town where the grass grew short and the wind did not stop long enough to settle. Prudence stood at Larkin's grave with one hand on Alma Dillard's arm. The two women had entered the story from different doors, one as a sister who would not accept the first answer, the other as a daughter born after the question had been buried. They did not speak during the service. Words had been overused in the county for 19 years. The saddles remained at the courthouse until the appeals ended. Afterward, Prudence took Larkin's Copper Star saddle home, though she never put it on a horse. Alma took Moss's saddle, wrapped in plain canvas, and kept it in a dry room above the print shop where she worked. Visitors sometimes asked why she kept such a heavy thing. She would tell them it was her father's. If they asked whether he had ridden far on it, she would say no, not as far as people claimed. That answer became its own correction. Years later, when the freight road was mostly grass, and only the spring still drew occasional travelers, a new marker was set near the place where Sage Hen Crossing had stood. It did not mention Sandcrow Wash. It did not mention Cleet Runnels except in the corrected county report. It gave the names of Larkin Bow and Moss Dillard, and said they were last known alive at the trading post, not beyond it. That change mattered. In old cases, justice sometimes came not by restoring what was taken, but by moving the last known place of a life back to the truth. On windy afternoons, dust still crossed Broomtail Creek in low sheets. It moved through the gap where the store door had been, over grass covering the hide yard, around the public trough built from new stone. The spring ran with a soft underground sound, indifferent to ownership, indifferent to reputation. Men watered horses there and read the marker if they were the sort to read. Some knew the full story. Some knew only that 2 frontiermen had vanished, and that 19 years later, their saddles were found inside the wall of the man who said he watched them ride away. The lie had sent them west for almost 2 decades. The saddles brought them back to the room where the night had actually ended.